just to keep the truth from you. Well, they'll lie and they'll buy and they'll spy and they'll grab and they'll lie some more. They're sly and they try to deny all the lies they've been busted for. Oh! They've left their ideals on the shelf. No wonder every man is for himself. Power is their one desire. The people drift while they climb up higher. Up we go. Up we go, yeah.
Yeah, we're here today to support Julian because Julian is a Melbourne person. And the reason we're here at the State Library is a lot of people won't know this, but the first big rallies that we had in this city of Melbourne in the 1850s were about State Library opening hours, that working class people wanted the library to be open for the sole reason that they could find true information for themselves. Now we move forward 150, 170 years and we're finding the same demands. Melbourne people want to know the truth of information themselves. And it's for that reason, and that reason only, that Julian Assange in Melbourne formed WikiLeaks, with the belief that if the people knew the truth, the governments would no longer be able to send us to war. He said, if wars are started by lies, peace can be started by the truth. The reason WikiLeaks started was as part of the peace movement here in Melbourne. And as Julian, one of our own, is languishing in Belmarsh Prison, Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh, fighting an extradition order to the United States in a trial that starts on Monday, when he's not a US citizen and he never committed any crimes anywhere, but it's not even alleged he committed crimes in the United States. What we're talking here is the demand of the United States government to have an American exceptionalism where its laws can capture any person, any citizen of any country, anywhere in the world. This is not just about Julian. This is not just about the rights to free speech and the job and the role of journalists. This is about what our government, Scott Morrison, Prime Minister, and his government, and previous governments before him, whether we're talking Labor or Liberal, are doing to protect an Australian citizen who is trying to defend himself from exceptional American laws. That is why we're here today.
I think what happens to Julian Assange will happen to us all. So I stand up for my brother. We're demanding that he comes back home. He's an award-winning journalist, recognised in this country. What's wrong with Australia? Why can't they deal with this issue? Why can't Australia deal with the truth? We all know why, don't we? It's a lying, racist, sexist society that it is. It can't stand up. And that's what's the problem here. Julia Gillard, as far as I'm concerned, is largely responsible for what's happened to him. So, when are these people going to account? And when's Australia going to stand up? It's 2020. When's truth going to become an issue in this country? No, it's a joke. It's a disgrace to humanity, Australia. And the people have got themselves to blame as well. They allowed this shit to manifest. Why you got such a lurch to the right? It was always going to happen because it's been allowed to manifest from day one. It's a convict penal colony built on lies, deceit, fraud, propaganda, race hatred, indoctrination, no consent, treaties or jurisdiction. It's the land of the liar and the home of the thief. Wouldn't know what truth was. It's a joke. So, what sort of country do you have? You can't deal with the truth. You've got no truth, you've got no trust. So you got to a shitbag or a shithole country, in the words of Donald Trump. This is what Australia is. So that's why I'm here, standing up for what is right and what is true. All right, and that goes for our people. All these issues are related. And what's going to happen to journalism, investigative journalism in the future? If this what can happen to a journalist. So, you know, it's worth standing up for. We can't stand up for Julian Assange. Who the hell can we stand up for?
An Australian citizen is being tortured for exposing war crimes. Who do they think they are? Julian Assange is like me. He's a software engineer. I've used software Julian Assange has helped write. And I know if I was in Assange's position, I'd do the exact same damn thing. It is our obligation as citizens to expose corruption, expose war crimes, damn it.
Julian Assange was tortured, is tortured, and he was in the embassy, and that was a physical torture, psychological torture.
He's a bloody journalist. He's a journalist. He exposed the truth. That's not a crime. The American government is slowly chiseling away at our human rights bit by bit by bit. You need to stop them in their tracks, man, and this is it.
When he was in solitary confinement, it was 23 hours a day, half an hour for exercise, and half an hour to fight off all the prisoners to get to a phone. And that half an hour that he was going to go for his exercise and that half an hour for his phone calls, the prison had to clear all the aisles. Everybody had to be locked up. That is not right. He should not be there. Exposing crime is not prison sentence. Journalism is not a crime.
Those who profess to favour freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without ploughing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both. But it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Every one of us must keep demanding, keep fighting, keep thundering, keep ploughing, keep speaking, keep struggling until justice is served. No justice, no peace. Frederick Douglass, thank you very much.
A brother in arms who's been fighting alongside with us since day one and is one of Julian and WikiLeaks' biggest supporters in Melbourne. Indigenous elder, activist, warrior and all-round good bloke. Put it together for Robbie Thorpe.
Thanks, Jacob. I want to pay my respects to those unceded sovereigns of this land, the Kulin Nation, Woiwurrung, Wurundjeri, Bunurong country here, we're all enjoying. Like Jacob said, it's unceded sovereignty here. There's no consent to occupy this land or apply the backward dark age colonial laws here that you've got. We've already got law here, sustainable one. It's been around for a long, long time. And it'll be here after this colonialism's gone. Because that's part of the problem we got with dealing with the truth in this country. You can't stand up, Australia. It's the land of the liar and the home of the thief. And what sort of democracy is this? Blood-stained land and illegal occupation. It's just been going on too long. It's manifest from a convict penal colony, a British convict penal colony. That's what you grew out of. You wouldn't know what truth was if it run you over. To disgrace Australia. I want to pay my respects to all the people gathered here today. taken the time out to stand up for the truth. Because we haven't got truth. You haven't got trust. You haven't got nothing. Nothing. What happens to Julian will happen to every one of us. And we know it. We stand condemned. This country stands condemned. What happens to Julian Assange? He's an award-winning journalist in this country and elsewhere. He's been nominated for a Nobel Prize. What's going on, Australia? You need to step up. This country needs to show some form. They're largely responsible for the situation he's in. People like Julia Gillard. What have they done? What are they doing? What is the Greens doing? What's the Labor Party doing? What's any of them doing? Nothing.
The positives, it's great to see federal members standing up as real politicians, doing what they've pledged to do, and support the Australian people. So put it together. He's come all the way from Dandenong today. Federal ALP member for Brice, Julian L.
G'day. G'day Kevin. I've seen you for a few years. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present. Thank you for that speech and welcome to country, and to any other elders who may be here with us. I wanted to state a few contentions up front very clearly. The persecution and treatment of Julian Assange are unconscionable. He is an Australian citizen with the same rights as you or me. And our government, the Australian government's failure to speak out against extradition to the United States and demand his return is shameful. We should say that clearly. Now we hear a lot from ministers, weasel words about our legal process and will have his day in court, but true to form, the most offensive, the wrongest, the most immoral words came from the Prime Minister, who said Julian Assange should face the music, as if this was some ordinary case. And I'd say right at the outset, it is not an ordinary case. It is fundamentally and inherently political. And unlawful, they say. It corrupts and risks what public support exists. And I'll say this at the outset for the US-Australia alliance, when our government is too scared and too cowed to defend one of our own citizens. It corrupts our democracy when our government refuses to fight to defend Australian citizens just because they don't agree with their political philosophy. And most importantly, perhaps, and I'll get to this, the precedent that extradition would set would dangerously undermine our sovereignty and have a chilling effect on journalism and the media's ability in this country to hold power to account. Now, I applaud everyone who's taken the time to come here tonight to stand up and to speak up, giving voice to our values. The very act of doing so pushes back and actually strengthens our democracy, I believe. I'm a protester from way back. And I do stand with you here in my own capacity as a federal Labor member, but as a member of the cross-party parliamentary group fighting to see Julian freedom returned home, and also, importantly, to change public opinion. Because we know we've seen an incredible propaganda war for almost a decade now to brainwash people and obscure the truth. And I never thought, to tell you the truth, when I got elected to Parliament, that I'd find myself in a little club with Barnaby Joyce and George Christensen. But there you go, the meetings are always fun. But we do need to be very clear-eyed, and this is important, about what extradition to the United States would mean. It'd mean one of our citizens, one of us, would face an effective death sentence. The current charges would see Julian condemned for 175 years in extreme isolation in the US. And indeed in the state of Virginia they have the death penalty. There's nothing to say that he would not face the death penalty. And Australia proudly has a long history of opposing extradition to countries that have the death penalty. Now that alone, in my view, should be enough for our government to speak up and to push back. But then there's the torture that's been inflicted on him in the UK. It's not a phrase you often hear, is it, about an Australian, the torture that has been inflicted on him in the United Kingdom. And it should not be said lightly and must never become acceptable. But the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Neil Malza, investigated his case, and I'll read 2 quick quotes. He said all the symptoms for prolonged exposure to psychological torture were shown, and his health condition was so dire that his very life was now at risk. Now, other speakers will talk about the health impacts, but I do say that when the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture says that one of our citizens has been tortured, the Australian government must demand that he board home. They must speak up, they must speak out, and they must bring him home. You can't say this is normal or acceptable. You can't just kick it off at a press conference and say next question. Now, it doesn't matter, and this is important, it doesn't matter whether you agree with him, it doesn't matter whether you like him, it doesn't matter whether you dislike him. He's an Australian, and he's entitled to the protection of our government. But even beyond the individual justice, if the death penalty and the torture aren't enough to spur our government to action, there are broader, deeper principles perhaps at stake, because there is much more to this inherently political case. He's been persecuted by the most powerful governments in the world for a decade, because he needs to be punished for exposing their war crimes and misuse of state power. That's his real crime. That's what they're really going after him for. To silence him in the WikiLeaks project and to scare others into silence, the chilling effect, and that is incredibly serious. Now I know I may not be in a majority here, that I don't personally agree with everything he's said or everything he's done. I've read a couple of his books, I found them challenging many years ago, and I did not agree with a lot of them. I did agree with some of them. But that's not the point. Agreeing with him is not the point. It is not, it cannot, and must not ever be the point in a democracy if we're to protect our democratic values. Now the case does go to the importance of journalism and journalists in a democracy holding power to account. Publishing embarrassing classified footage of the Iraq War is journalistic behaviour, supposedly protected by the First Amendment to the US Constitution. And I'll quote Kevin Rudd. If the case is essentially that Julian Assange broke the law by obtaining and disclosing secret information, then I struggle to see what separates him from any journalist who solicits, obtains and publishes such information. Now one of the other, go Kevin, who knew? One of the other claims is that he's not a journalist, and that is irrelevant. Again, it's not the point, it's a distraction. The protections under the law apply to journalistic activities, not a special magical class of people. They could apply to me, they could apply to you if you engage in such publishing activities. And what he published is no different in principle to the Pentagon Papers in 1971 that exposed similar misadventures during the Vietnam War and excesses of power by 2 United States presidents. And that was upheld by the US Supreme Court. So the chilling effect that this case would have on so-called mainstream media is profound. The pursuit is deliberate and it's calculated to mute whistleblowing and shut down investigative journalism to the military and this kind of power. And if he's guilty of serious crime for publishing classified material for war crimes, then our very democracies are weakened. Media will be too scared to publish in the future. Now one thing, and this is kind of a nerdy point, but the more you look into us, this is one of the most important things that I believe Australians have to understand, which is this dangerous principle in this case of extraterritoriality, which is getting lost in the propaganda. But we should be very clear, Australians should be very, very clear. If this American bid succeeds, the precedent is frightening. Because whatever he did in 2010-11, it's not espionage. There's no evidence he attempted to hack into US government computers. There's no evidence that he coerced or got someone else to try and do so. There's also no evidence that lives were lost or serious harm done. But the point is, he's not a US citizen, and the actions that he took place outside the United States. The publication of material took place outside the United States. But if under this precedent that would be set if he is extradited and they get the video images they want of him shuffling around in leg shackles in a US prison, then what that means is anyone who publishes anything that offends the US state and the US government could then be prosecuted anywhere in the world under the US Espionage Act, including journalists in Australia or any Australian. And our government should defend our sovereignty and these freedoms. And look, the final substantive sort of scene-setting point, if you like, we've got a lot of speakers focusing on particular issues, and I'm trying to give perhaps an overview. But it is the sexual assault allegations and the conflicting and often sensational, salacious reporting for many years. Allegations of sexual assault and rape are incredibly serious matters that should not be weaponised or misused for political purposes. Now, you read a lot of articles and you're left confused. What do I believe? Well, that media confusion, in my view, is deliberate. Julian Assange shone light on power and exposed corruption. And suddenly and skillfully, this bright light has turned back to shine on him. This is not an accident. He's a hacker. He's a narcissist. He's a spy. He doesn't shower. He doesn't look after his cat properly, you know. And then all of a sudden, he's a creepy predator. Citizens must not suspend their critical thinking and analytical brain when these kind of allegations are made. I'd encourage people who wonder about the truth of these to read the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture's case review. He makes clear, and these are not my contentions, these are his. Dangerous stuff for a politician to talk about this issue, so I'll stick to his contentions. He was subjected to a preliminary investigation for 9 years with no charges. The police tampered and rewrote evidence to manufacture these accusations. Julian Assange did not run away from interview by the Swedish authorities. He actually went to the authorities and the police several times when in Sweden. He was given permission by the authorities to leave the country. It was when he was in London that he heard of secret proceedings in the United States to extradite him. And yet still he offered repeatedly to return to Sweden, provided an assurance was given that he would not then be extradited to the United States. He offered to give evidence over many years from asylum in person, by video link. But the objective, of course, was not to investigate in a real way. It wasn't to keep the investigation alive. It was to keep it in suspended animation for 9 years without ever laying a charge. But of course, magically then, the case was dropped when he was in British custody and able to face extradition. Remember, that's not my analysis. That's a UN Special Rapporteur on torture. And so despite all of this, despite the effective death sentence, the torture, the obvious manifest injustice, our government refuses to speak up for this Australian. Ministers hide behind their weasel words, and I'll say again, it doesn't matter whether you agree with him or like him or dislike him. He's an Australian. He has the same rights as all of us. He's entitled to the protection of our government, and he deserves our support. And so I've used a lot of words, but I might just finish with that lovely phrase that I heard Andrew Wilkie and George Christensen use this week in London. They said aptly, he's our rat bag and we must bring him home. So again, I thank you. There are many federal parliamentarians who stand with you, who do speak up, and I encourage you to continue your fight and to keep speaking up, and also, as you said, go and fill out a postcard and cheer him up. Thank you very much.
Keep putting it together. Federal MP for Brice, Julian Hill. Mr. Julian. To Andrew Wilkie, who was in Belmont visiting Julian this week, and he tried to make it live but he couldn't. He sent along a little video for us. He put together on his phone just for the rally here for you mob here in Melbourne today. So here's Julian, here's Andrew. Whoops.
G'day, this is Wilkie in London, where yesterday I spent 90 minutes visiting Julian Assange in Belmarsh High Security Prison. I regret to report that Julian is clearly a man under enormous pressure, and every now and then I get glimpses of a broken man. The injustice of his circumstances are just breathtaking, because at the end of the day, all he really did was act as a journalist and a publisher and reveal very important information in the public interest, including hard evidence of US war crimes. He shouldn't be in Belmarsh. He shouldn't be facing 17 counts of espionage and 1 count of hacking. He shouldn't go to the US. He shouldn't face the very real prospect of life in prison. There's a compelling case, absolutely compelling, for Scott Morrison to pick up the phone and to tell Boris Johnson he must release what is a political prisoner. And he must get on the phone to Donald Trump and say he must drop an attempt to extradite Julian for political purposes. In essence, the extradition must be dropped. He must be allowed to return to Australia. And I would add the support he's getting from right around Australia, in particular there in Melbourne. He understands that, he appreciates it, and it does give him some comfort.
Our next speaker would be known to many of you. She's been working on social justice campaigns and transparency campaigns for a long time. She really needs no other introduction I could give, and she's going to hate me for saying this. She'll probably kick me, but she's one of my heroes. Please put it together for Joan Coxedge.
We're here today to show our support for Julian Assange. He's a brave Australian who's fighting for his life. Most of you know the facts, or some of the facts, that Julian Assange spent 7 years holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, ostensibly for a bail violation, before being thrown out by British police after the election of Ecuador's new, brutal, pro-torture President Moreno, who decided to revoke his right of asylum. Since last April, he's been incarcerated in London's notorious Belmarsh maximum security prison, where he spent 23 hours a day stuck in a cell in total isolation, heavily sedated and denied medical treatment, with no access to a laptop, a lawyer or his family. After a lot of pressure, he's been moved to a different part of the prison, but is still confined for more than 20 hours a day. On the 24th of February, that's only a couple of days away, London's Woolwich Crown Court will decide whether he will be extradited to the United States to face 18 charges under the Espionage Act, each carrying a sentence of 10 years. A hearing that will last for about a week and then resume on the 18th of May for another 3 weeks. If his court appearance last November is anything to go by, he certainly won't get a fair hearing. He appeared before a dodgy magistrate with links to the British military establishment, who didn't even pretend to listen to what was being said. The charges were specific and had nothing to do with Sweden, nothing to do with sex, and nothing to do with the 2016 US federal election, but everything to do with publishing the Iraqi war logs, the Afghani war logs, and US State Department cables, because they exposed massive war crimes and corruption by the US military and intelligence establishment. There was also a video showing an American helicopter crew laughing and joking as they gunned down civilians, including children and 2 Reuters journalists in a Baghdad street. And there was an exposure of Hillary Clinton's corruption and mendacity. She got millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, 2 major funders of the Islamic State. and a load of money from Goldman Sachs that could only be described as a bribe. She was also shown to be the principal architect of the war in Libya, a war she thought would help her win an election, but which destroyed a nation. Everyone in that court saw one of the greatest journalists and most important dissidents of our time being tortured to death before our eyes, said former British Ambassador Craig Murray. There were 5 representatives of the US government present in that court, seated at desks behind James Lewis QC and other prosecution lawyers. Lewis actually admitted that he was taking instructions from behind, meaning a British judge in a British court was being dictated to by the US Embassy. And it has now been disclosed on prime-time German TV that while Julian was in the embassy, a Spanish private security firm made audio and video recordings of all his meetings with lawyers, photographed the passports of all his visitors and took their phones, all of which was passed on to the CIA, claims being investigated by Spain's High Court. The program also showed how allegations against Julian were made up and manipulated to keep him in jail. The particularly nasty allegation that led many to believe Assange was a rapist were also shown to be fraudulent. The documents were invented in the same way that George W. Bush, Tony Blair and John Howard lied that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction to justify the Iraq War when more than 1 million people died. Once Julian was arrested by British police, the sexual assault case was dropped. The publication of classified documents is not yet a crime in the United States. If Assange is extradited and convicted, it will become one, bearing in mind that he is not an American citizen, he is an Australian, and WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication. His extradition would mean the end of journalistic investigations into the inner workings of power, and it would cement into place a terrifying global corporate tyranny under which borders, nationality and law mean nothing. Once such a legal precedent is set, any publication that publishes classified material from the New York Times to the Melbourne Age or to an alternative website will be prosecuted and silenced. A fact that the mainstream media appear incapable of understanding, even though Australian Federal Police raided the homes and offices of the ABC and the commercial newspaper after a series of reports called the Afghan Files, based on leaked defence documents. And this week, a federal court judge has ruled the raids were valid and that the broadcaster must pay the legal costs. You would think, wouldn't you, that there would be public outrage against this official support for intimidation of the press. Nothing. Just silence. Mostly silence. Not completely, because you're here today. But to our shame, WikiLeaks has done more than any other news organisation to expose the abuse of power and crimes of the American empire. If our journalists reckon these war logs and all the other disclosures should have remained hidden, then they have lost the right to be given the title of journalist. But a multitude of voices are now speaking out. In the Commons, Jeremy Corbyn urged Boris Johnson to back the Council of Europe, who called for Julian's immediate release. Corbyn's decisive action came shortly after Julian was nominated for the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize. How many of you read about that? Along with Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, the nomination letter stated that the three needed to be recognised for their, quote, unprecedented contributions to the pursuit of peace and their immense personal sacrifices. Assange has also won the 2020 Gary Webb Freedom of the Press Award. As Julian said, populations don't like wars. They have to be lied into them. Throughout all of Julian's protracted ordeal, not one word of support from the Australian government or the Labor Party. The lack of support for an Australian citizen from the government and Labor is a national disgrace. By every elected politician in all three levels of government, except for a weird pair, Andrew Wilkie and George Christensen, and our federal member who spoke here earlier today, and the handful in the committee, and I congratulate them. But we Australians need to stand up, to speak out, to protest in the clearest and most visible way, to demand that Julian Assange should be immediately released from prison and brought home, and to tell the United States to bugger off. This is a critical moment for press freedom and our right to know. If there is any sense of justice left, the travesty that is the case against Australian citizen Julian Assange must be thrown out, and he must be brought home as a free man. If he isn't, then we're heading into darker times where the US empire will continue on its destructive path unchecked. And freedom of speech will be a thing of the past. So if you have to, don't be silent. Shout from the rooftops and shout as loud as you can. Thank you.
Social commentator, footy reporter, and all-round troublemaker, Rowan Connolly.
I'm a football writer, so eloquence isn't necessarily a strength. But I do want to, get to some fundamentals, put them in terms that your average footy head can understand. So my name is Rowan Connolly. I guess you could class me as a veteran of the journalistic scene, and that's because media veteran these days constitutes anyone who's been in the industry longer than about 5 minutes. This is in fact my 37th year in the media, and I've spent the vast bulk of that time writing and speaking about AFL football and a variety of sports. So you're quite entitled to respond, what the bloody hell are you doing here? Well, I'm here for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I'm a journalist, and regardless of whether you write about strained diplomatic relations or strained hamstrings, Julian Assange's case goes to the very heart of what journalism is about, and that's uncovering and publishing facts that are in the public interest. That's better. I feel like Peter Garrett. But even more importantly, I'm here simply as a citizen of a country which supposedly prides itself on democratic ideals and freedom of speech. And the fact that Julian Assange is facing extradition to a country of which he is not a citizen and in which his actions weren't carried out, whilst the country of which he is a citizen does the barest minimum to assist him, should be an affront to anyone who lives here. We're supposed to be the land of the fair go. Now, there's enough evidence in recent times to suggest that is no longer the case, but there's few examples better than that of Julian Assange in demonstrating our government's disturbing lack of moral fibre when it comes to standing up for what is right. That's why this cause has attracted supporters from across the political spectrum, left and right, because ultimately this shouldn't be about agendas. It shouldn't be about axes to grind. It should simply be about doing the bloody right thing. The bottom line is that Julian Assange is one of us. The bottom line is that the work for which he is being prosecuted actually lifted the lid on serious US war crimes and laid bare the often spurious reasoning for government policy. If the result of that can possibly be a 175-year jail term, the world truly has gone mad. And it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can to prevent that from happening. What Assange did was truth-telling. It was clearly in the public interest, and it was work good enough to win a Walkley Award for, quote, outstanding contribution to journalism. That's from journalists.
A number of doctors from around the world have got their acts together and penned a letter to the Australian and British governments to raise concerns of the effect on Julian's health of how he's been treated. We're really fortunate to have one of those doctors with us today. Dr. Margaret Beavis is not only part of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, she's also a current GP and teaches medicine at Melbourne University. She knows what she's talking about, and she's here to give us a bit of a yarn today. So can you all stick them together for Dr. Margaret Beavis? Thank you.
I'm one of 120 odd doctors who signed a letter. We've sent letters to the British government, we've sent letters to the Australian government saying that we need an end to the psychological torture and the medical neglect of Julian Assange. The case of Julian Assange, as people have already said, has many aspects: law, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, journalism, publishing and politics. But it also clearly relates to medicine and clearly relates to human rights. As doctors, we got together after it was reported at the court case last October. There were reports from the ex-UK diplomat Craig Murray and from the journalist John Pilger. They described Julian Assange as limping and aged, struggling to recall basic information, struggling to focus his thoughts and articulate his words. At the end of the day, Julian said he didn't really understand what had happened in the court, and this is one of the sharpest minds of our generation. In his time in the Ecuadorian embassy, we now know that there was covert 24-hour surveillance. His rights to privacy, to a personal life, his legal privilege, his freedom of speech, all gone. Also gone was his privacy, his doctor-patient relationship. A lot has been said about the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer. He visited Julian Assange with two medical experts who are also specialists in torture. He reported, and this is in May last year, Mr. Assange showed all the symptoms typical of prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. 6 months later, Mr. Melzer warned, the continued exposure to arbitrariness and abuse may soon end up costing his life. This is no surprise. Julian Assange has been held in the highest security Belmarsh prison for more than almost a year, in conditions amounting largely to solitary confinement. The UK government, throughout his time in the Ecuadorian embassy, refused to allow him safe passage to hospital despite medical needs, and it continues to refuse to transfer him now. Nils Melzer, oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Nils Melzer, the specialist on torture, wrote, 4 democratic countries have joined forces, and by that he meant the UK, Sweden, Ecuador and the US. I would add Australia as a 5th. So 4 countries have joined forces to leverage their power to portray one man as a monster, so that later he could be burned at the stake without an outcry. This case is a huge scandal and represents a complete failure of the Western rule of law. When this United Nations expert wrote to the British government in May 2019, shamefully they took 6 months to answer. When they did answer, it was a single page, limited to rejecting all the accusations of torture and all the inconsistencies in legal proceedings. Now, skipping bail in the UK normally is just a result, you get a fine. It very seldom results in prison sentences, let alone torture. However, Julian Assange has already served 50 weeks in the maximum security Belmarsh prison, and until very recently in solitary confinement. All this just for skipping bail. What is happening to Julian Assange is inhumane and totally unacceptable. As doctors, we're calling for Julian Assange to be transferred from Belmarsh prison to a university hospital for urgent assessment and proper treatment. As doctors, we're calling on the Australian government to bring Julian Assange home to Australia. As doctors, we're calling on the Australian government to intervene to protect the health of its citizen. The behaviour of the Australian government so far, both Labor and Liberal, has been a complete disgrace. In the interests of defending medical ethics, in the human right to health, and in taking a stand against torture, our appeal is very simple. We call on all the governments to end the torture of Assange and to ensure access to the best available health care before it is too late. The Australian government has a duty of care to its citizens, and in the case of Julian Assange, it has completely failed that duty of care. We must bring Julian Assange home. Thank you.
So we might bring up our next speaker because we're having trouble reaching John in London or in Paris or in Geneva. I know where he was yesterday. I know where he'll be tomorrow. I'm not sure where he is right now. All right. So our next speaker from Class Consciousness, who's been a supporter of WikiLeaks and of Julian for a long time, who's been doing letter writing campaigns, street stalls, speaking at all kinds of occasions, put it together for our own Davey Heller.
G'day. The fascist in the White House, Donald Trump, is leading the global attack on the rights of the working class with his persecution of Assange. The Defend Assange campaign is correctly characterised as a free speech campaign. However, it must also be seen as part of the class struggle and the working class fight back against fascism. Today, the war on journalism is the spearhead of what is really a class war, and Julian Assange is a class war prisoner. Without access to journalism, which tells the truth about the crimes of imperial power, without the fundamental right to know the truth, all rights of the working class, won in a struggle of the last century, are existentially threatened. At root, the fight to free Julian Assange must be seen as an industrial struggle. Therefore, only the international working class, organised in the fight to free Julian, has the social power to win his freedom. I'm getting to them. This is why the launch of Workers Assange is necessary. Good question. Julian Assange himself has called for industrial organising in his defence. In early November 2019, one of the few letters from Julian to supporters to break the cruel information blockade being maintained by Belmarsh prison emerged. The letter was sent to a supporter in France, and the letter read, "Dear Anne-Marie, you ask what you can do to fight for my freedom. Use your strongest skills, friends and resources, and associations. If you are a nurse, gather nurses, create a block in the nurses' union, etc." The import of Julian urging workers to organise industrially in his defence cannot be overstated. It reveals that Julian himself understands that only a mass movement of the working class has the power to free him. I keep using this phrase, the working class. Who am I referring to? Yes, exactly. Marx defined the working class as everyone who has to survive by earning a wage. This is the vast majority of humanity, who all share the same social interests of wanting access to good healthcare, housing, democratic rights, and education and a clean environment. The working class isn't therefore just blue-collar workers or factory workers, but it's teachers, nurses, retail workers, people in the service industry, etc. As I said, it's the vast majority of humanity, and it would definitely be everyone at this rally. There's already been the stirrings of a working class orientated campaign to free Julian. Do you guys know about the yellow vest contingents who have been, 3 times they've already travelled on ferries and buses from France to London. On January 25th, 2 coachloads, 100 of them, marched around the walls of Belmarsh demanding Julian's freedom. And it was no coincidence, yes. Woo. And it was no coincidence that the day before they arrived, January 24th, Julian was moved back to the general population out of the so-called healthcare ward. They knew that the French yellow vests were coming. And they're going to be another 2 busloads of them will be there on Monday at the start of the court case at Belmarsh. And workers have already organised in professional blocks. We already heard from Margie from Doctors for Assange, who have been doing a fantastic job. Over 100 doctors have written an open letter to demand Julian be moved out of prison to a hospital so he can recover. Journalists, over 1,200 journalists have signed a letter on the Speak Out for Assange page. Rank and file teachers in Melbourne and Sydney have passed motions in support of Assange. Unionists in California at the San Francisco Labor Council and the Pacific Media Guild have also passed motions, but this must be built on. Today in Independent Australia, there's been a call out, which I wrote, for the creation of Workers for Assange. Independent Australia, have you all guys heard about that? It's an online progressive publication which have been supporting Julian Assange a lot. Check it out, independentaustralia.net.au, I think, just Google it. And they've published today the call out for Workers for Assange. To take this fight forward, workers must join together. Whilst unions are a major focus of this campaign, the reality is not all workers are in unions. And we also have to recognise the unions, they're not here today, are they? We have to recognise that. Julian Assange is a member of the MEAA. Why is there not a banner here from the MEA? So we have to take on board that the union bureaucracies are enthralled to the political parties and the interests who are ultimately lining up with US imperialism in the conspiracy with Assange. Shame. No union has sought to seriously mobilise its members through protest strikes or stop work meetings. That's why ordinary workers need to organise. Use your associations, like Julian Assange said. So workers, yes, we're in workplaces, but we're also in political parties. Some branches of the Labor branches have already passed motions in the UK. The Northern Territory Alice Greens branch passed a motion. Some local councils have passed motions. If you're on university, students, high schools, use your associations. and organise for Assange. We need to mobilise on a mass level. So lastly, I would just say, take this on, you know, this is great today, we're part of already a global protest movement, but we know we need to take this to the next level. We need to mobilise as workers, we need to mobilise internationally, and workers, all of us here, we should unite for Assange. Free Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning.
So, John, are you there?
Yes, yes. Hello, Jacob.
I hope you can hear the crowd there, John. Now, we're looking forward to seeing you on the big screen, mate. But you want to give your address to the crowd, brother?
Jacob, are you there? Is everybody there?
Everybody's
there. Can
you
hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, friends, ladies and gentlemen, supporters. We're in Vienna by invitation to see the Foreign Affairs Committee here. It's our first official invitation. The movement here in Europe is extremely strong, particularly Germany and France. In Switzerland, on Wednesday there will be a vote for a humanitarian visa for Julian. I saw Julian about 4 days ago. I see him again on the 23rd. He's bearing up well. His conditions have changed. Now he has access to 40 other prisoners. Let me tell you that the prisoners themselves brought about this change. The prisoners took up 3 distinct petitions and served them on the government. So the pressure from the prisoners, not all those NGOs, brought about Julian moving out of isolation and into some company. Julian's circumstances have improved, but his health remains hazardous. The hearing begins on the 24th, with the prosecution claiming to have 3.5 hours, the first 3.5, that'll mean the whole day, to issue their lies and calumnies and exaggerations. So there's plenty of counter support, and you can be able to catch the revelations on the surveillance of Julian with his lawyers. Actually, there's even surveillance of me bringing him dinner on Christmas, video and voice. The cruelty, the sort of trajectory of increasing persecution of Julian over 10 years, with every single human right abrogated, every law that covers procedure broken, misfeasance, malfeasance, distortion of procedure. It continues up to this day with difficulty Julian has of getting access to his lawyers to be fully briefed on the evidence going before the hearing next week. Each day I'll send a report in by voice to 4ZZZ and the community radio station that Jacob works in Melbourne. I miss Melbourne very much, and I thank you for your support. And let me just say that I'm certain beyond measure that we Australians will bring Julian back to Australia.
Hello, brother, and thanks for joining us.
I'll hang up now, and I've got another interview to do with Austrian television. So, thanks.
Thanks, John. Put it together for John. There you go. Jerem Small was here with us when we had an event up there in the forecourt of the State Library in Julian's support, as were many, many people. And I'd like you to put it together from Victorian Socialists, Jerem Small.
I read somewhere that the truth will set you free, and Robbie reminded us of that in the first speech that we heard tonight. The truth will set you free. I guess it doesn't really look like that, and it doesn't really feel like that if you're inside a tomb of concrete and steel in Belmarsh Prison, London, for the crime of telling the truth. I guess it doesn't really feel like that or look like that if you're in a tomb of concrete and steel in Alexandra Detention Centre in Virginia, which is where Chelsea Manning is right now and for the last 11 months for daring to tell the truth. And the truth is, of course, that the Australian state in recent decades has made a speciality of locking in tombs of concrete and steel and racism and border force lies thousands upon thousands of refugees who have made their way here. And the toll of that in terms of people tortured and disabled and murdered like Reza Barati. We just passed the anniversary a couple of days ago. We should remember them when we're telling the truth about what we're up against with the Australian state. And the truth is that that same state, the Australian state, that is doing their very best to make sure that Chelsea and Julian die in a tomb of concrete and steel, that same state invaded Iraq twice, once under Labor in the 90s, once under the Liberals in the 2000s, in search of oil and empire, in the service of oil and empire. And in order to keep that oil flowing, and in order to keep that empire supreme, they are prepared to do anything. Whether that means the destruction of hundreds of thousands or even millions of lives in Iraq, whether that means raiding the ABC, whether that means raiding News Limited of all people, whether that means, the crimes that we've seen, atrocities, obscenities like Witness K. We can't even name him, Witness J. A secret trial on secret charges in a secret court happening in Canberra just a year ago. That's the extent that our state, that the Australian state is prepared to go to keep that oil and empire, to keep that oil flowing and that empire supreme. And that's why Chelsea and Julian are in a tomb of concrete and steel today. We know another thing, which is that telling the truth will not set us free. Telling the truth is a bloody good start, and without it, we're all sunk. But in order to set Julian and to set Chelsea free, we need a lot more than that. We need persistence, we need bloody-mindedness, we need people like Jacob and all of his crew that have got us here tonight and stick a foot in our arse to remind us what solidarity is. We need organisation like what Davey was telling us. We need the individuals, and I'm one and there's other people here, individual unionists, to step up and make this an issue, not just for the few gathered here today, but for the thousands and the millions who it actually affects. That's what we need to do. And there's only one thing that we can do, which is to keep going. And if I can, if through some chink in that, through some crack in that concrete and steel and barbed wire and legal bullshit and fear, if through all of that somehow this video and these words and this gathering makes it through to Chelsea and Julian, we are pledging our love, we are pledging our strength, and most of all, we are pledging our solidarity. They are in there for us, and we are out here for you, Julian and Chelsea. Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Julian Assange! Free Chelsea Manning! Free Chelsea Manning!
Our final speaker tonight may be known to quite a few of you, should be known to all of you. Independent journalist who in her own way has turned away news delivered to us upside down from CaitlinJohnson.com. Independent journalist. Caitlin Johnson, please put it together.
Hello, thank you for coming everyone. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and the elders. Now, Julian Assange started a leak outlet on the premise that corrupt and unaccountable power is a problem in our world, and that problem can be fought with the light of truth. Corrupt and unaccountable power responded by detaining, silencing, and smearing him. His persecution proved his own thesis about the world absolutely correct. Now, power is the ability to control what happens, but absolute power is controlling what people think about what happens. Humans are story-oriented creatures, so if you can control the stories that the humans are telling each other about what's going on, you can control those humans. That's the power of narrative management. That's why governments and billionaires use propaganda, they advertise, they build up media conglomerates, they fund think tanks, they employ public relations and spin doctors, they buy up troll armies and bot farms because they know that those who control the narrative control the world. You can do pretty much whatever you like as long as you can control what people think about what you're doing. So no one understood this better than Julian Assange. He famously said that if wars are started by lies, then they can be stopped by truth. That's the basis of WikiLeaks, bringing truth to the public in the most pristine and revolutionary way possible. Yeah, give it up for WikiLeaks. Cracking open journalism in a really real way. They made it so people could leak documents to them safely and then release them with minimal redactions and editorial. Like many online innovations, it cut out the middleman. And the middleman, in this case, are the media spinmeisters who normally present information with an overlay of establishment-friendly narrative. You know the ones who are like, here's what I found out, but more importantly, here is what you should think about it. It had an immediate effect, global reach, exposing the most corrupt roots of the most powerful people in an environment where the growing alarm at the GFC, climate change, endless war meant that people were really hungry for truth about why these things are still happening, despite their unpopularity and despite our every effort to stop them. Assange is said to have read every single release of the 10 million or more documents that WikiLeaks has published, which is why when I heard that it confirmed that the psychological torture they're putting him under was damaging his beautiful mind, I literally sank to my knees and wept. The spotlight his persecution has thrown on the institution of journalism is one of the untold stories, mainly because the villains in this story are the journalists, which are the people we usually rely on us to tell us stories. This corruption was unearthed not so much through leaked documents, but through what we have been witnessing as the media-driven public mobbing of Julian Assange, the person. The mainstream media, to this day, lies constantly about Assange. If you pick up any recent story about Assange, it will be littered today with smears and lies. They'll say offhand how he colluded with the Russians, like that was true, or that he was charged with rape, or they have a throwaway line about how he smeared poo on the walls of the embassy. Or they'll say the reason he was granted asylum by Ecuador was to flee rape charges, like that could even be a thing. There are dozens and dozens of lies, and they get repeated as truth throughout any reporting on Assange, even months or years after being debunked. Assange has only ever been persecuted because he exposed US war crimes. No one has ever gone to jail for those war crimes, but instead of concentrating on that, the press decided to go after Assange. So let's be clear, when journalists use their power and privilege to cover up and to divert attention from war crimes, they become war criminals themselves. So thank God journalists are finally waking up to the fact that the legal precedent set by the Trump administration, the precedent that they're setting by reaching out across the Atlantic and taking an Australian journalist in the Ecuadorian embassy in the middle of the UK is devastating to journalism all over the world. Not just in the US, not in the UK, but all over the world. No journalist is safe, because if they can do that to him, they can do that to any of us. We learned that the United States do not consider foreign nationals to have First Amendment protection either. So the US is effectively saying that the long arm of the US law can extend to get you anywhere, but they also don't have to extend you its protections. So journalists are finally realising this, but the silence is pretty bloody deafening still. Australian journalists should be writing furious op-eds, vigorously defending Assange and demanding that our politicians act immediately. But the best we get are these tepid, smear-laden, mealy-mouthed, wet squibs of copy that try to maintain that they were, of course, correct in the past, but also hit the alarm button, and it just doesn't work. Until journalists admit they were wrong, and Assange was right, and the US really did want him in jail for publishing, like he said back in 2010, back when they were calling him paranoid, their readers aren't going to notice that it's time to change course. They aren't going to know that it's time to act. There's a lot of confusion, I've noticed. I don't know if you've been talking to a lot of your friends and family, but there is a lot of confusion about Assange now. Alan Jones had a very popular Facebook poll going this morning asking whether the Australian government should intervene and bring Assange home. I saw it just before lunch, and it was at 75% for yes, bring him home, yes! The winds of change, right? Yeah, and there was thousands of votes. It had only been open for a few hours, but it was, it was going very well. Had 6 days to go. It was gathering hundreds and hundreds too of pro-Assange comments, which just, that touched that was so tasty. Like, it's so good to read good stuff about Assange after reading so much crap all these times. But Jones deleted it. He did. But obviously that was not the response he was planning on. So, there's confusion and there is silence. But silence is space. A space has opened up before us. Can you feel it? Yes. In Australia right now, there are two kinds of people. Those who think that Assange should be brought home, and those who don't really want to think about it at all. They've gone quiet, right? And we're so used to being on the defence, we've gone a bit quiet too. Here's my point. The narrative is there for the taking. All we have to do is stand up as one and take control of this story. Let our voices ring out. This man is innocent. We must bring him home. Publishing is not a crime. Viva Assange!
Please, you know that you can say you were here when the rest aren't. So go home when you're done, talk to your friends, talk to your families, talk to your comrades. Thank you all for coming, and put it together for Ben Fuller.
I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things from neurotic, big-headed, psychotic politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. No short-haired, yellow-bellied,